Hello friends, welcome back to the Buffalo Happy Hour. My name is Derek and today we're going to be talking about the absolutely wonderful world of whiskey. So whether you're new to the spirit or you're just here to brush up on some knowledge, you're in the right spot. Let's get into it. So we're going to start off at the top. What is whiskey? I mean, it's the title of today's episode, right? So what Mike and I wanted to do with this series is to tell all of you and educate you on the spirit that we like to drink almost every day. Kind of every day, almost every day. It's whiskey. So what is it? So whiskey is an umbrella term that really covers basically everything that we have on the table right now. Outside of these two at the end, which I will get into why they're not considered whiskey a little bit later on. But whiskey legally has to be comprised of four key elements. The first one is what we call mash bill. So a mash bill is kind of just a fancy word for a recipe or ingredient list. And these ingredients that make up whiskey are basically cereal grains, water, and yeast. That's really it. So the term cereal grains, as you guess it, is probably any grain that can make up your normal, typical, everyday cereal. Anything from wheat to barley to rye, those type of cereals or the cereal grain makeup itself is what is required to be in whiskey. So the ingredient list that really makes up whiskey is what defines the characteristics of the whiskey before it gets put into a barrel. There's four main types of whiskey when you're looking at it stateside that you're probably going to run into when you go into a liquor store. The first one is bourbon. Bourbon is made up of at least 51% corn. If it doesn't reach that 51% corn level, it legally cannot be called bourbon. Second, you have rye whiskey here. If it's not made up of 51% rye grain, it can't be legally called a rye whiskey. Now these two right here, the Irish and the Scotch whiskey, those are generally defined by the region that they were made in. Obviously, Scotch is made in Scotland, Irish whiskey is made in Ireland, and they have their own set of rules that we can get into in a future episode, but they can be made up of any cereal grain. These two in front of me are made up of mostly barley. The Scotch is made up of 100% malted barley, and the Irish whiskey, this one is made up of a mix between malted and unmalted barley. So you can have different grains based off of the region as well, but for this specific topic, we're going to talk about all whiskeys. The second requirement is that it has to be distilled less than 190 proof. Now, if you're into the vodka world, that's super weird, but that's normal for you guys, is that you normally have it up that high with your proof being skyrocketed to where it almost blows out your insides because of how hot in ethanol it is. But whiskey, you have to distill it less than 190 proof. Again, there's some regional specifics into what actually it has to be, but generally speaking, 190 proof covers all of this here. The third rule is it has to be put into an oak container. So there's an old phrase or an old story that said, somebody once said, if you go to a still, which is those big things that you see in distilleries used to make whiskey, if you go to that still, open it up and fill up a wooden oak thimble and you drink it, that technically can be considered whiskey because there's no age statement on how long it has to be in for the whiskey. Again, whiskey. These are generalizations to apply to the overarching umbrella term that is whiskey. Each one of these has specific requirements. Again, we'll get into that in a future episode. But what's really important about that oak container is that 70% of the whiskey's flavor comes from that oak barrel. So when you start looking at bourbon, where it has to be a new char American oak barrel, you're getting a very, very specific flavor coming out of most American-made whiskeys that call themselves bourbon because of the legal requirement for bourbon to be aged in a new char American oak barrels. Whereas the Scotch here from Lagavulin is aged in an ex-sherry cask. So you can only imagine the difference in taste when you're comparing a at least 51% corn product aged in a new char American oak barrel to a 100% malted barley product made in Scotland that was once aged in a bourbon barrel and then also finished in a sherry cask. Vastly different flavor notes there. And the final requirement, number 4, is that it must be bottled at least 80 proof. And I note that because one of these up here does not meet that requirement. So let's get into some of the brands that aren't technically considered whiskey. Probably one of your most well-known brands, I don't have it up here, but I have something that still fits that requirement, is Cask and Crew. So Cask and Crew is made from cereal grains, but they add in additional flavors. This one is their ginger spice. So they add in a little bit of ginger spice flavors, and that right there, because they're adding in flavors, means that they cannot technically call this whiskey. So how do they normally get around it? They say whiskey with ginger spice flavors. So they're not marketing themselves completely as a whiskey, but they're putting on the label that is whiskey with ginger spice flavors. A brand that you're probably more familiar with, Fireball, same thing. Fireball is adding cinnamon extract to that whiskey product, so they can no longer call themselves a whiskey. They have to call themselves a whiskey with cinnamon extract or a whiskey with cinnamon natural flavors or whatever they might want to put on that label to deceive you to think that it's whiskey. But in reality, that adding of natural flavors or anything additional outside of those cereal grains cannot technically be considered whiskey anymore. So again, we're speaking in generalities here because I want you all to know when you go to the liquor store, 99.9 of what you see on the shelves cannot be considered whiskey if they add additional flavors to it. With the caveat of Canadian whiskey, because Canada's weird. We can all agree with that, right? In fact, Canadian whiskey can contain up to 9.09% of additional flavor. So if you are going into the liquor store and you see Crown Apple or something along those lines, that technically can still be considered whiskey in Canada, so long as it is less than 9.09% of the flavor to the actual whiskey ratio. But most of the time when you walk into a liquor store and you see products like this Cask and Crew, like Fireball, or like any other product that is really advertising the fact that they have a different flavor in it, it technically cannot be considered whiskey anymore. If there's anything that I want you to get from this video is that whiskey is the umbrella term to describe all the other products below it. Think of it when you were younger and you were in geometry class and you heard that phrase of all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. Same thing applies to the whiskey world. All bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. All rye whiskey is whiskey, but not all whiskey is rye whiskey. All scotch is whiskey, but not all whiskey is scotch. So there's different ways for you to be able to categorize your different whiskey products based off of the mash bill. And again, we can go into that in a future episode if you would like me to dive further into them. Speaking of which, if you've hung around this long, please like this video, leave a comment down below. Let us know a topic that you would like us to bring up next month, because we're trying to do these and educate all of you so when you go into a liquor store, you're not looking around asking for help, looking like a true beta male. You actually know where you want to go, and you can pick up your whiskey product with confidence and know that you're going to enjoy it when you get back home. If you do want individual recommendations of different whiskey products, we also do whiskey reviews every single Wednesday, every single week, where you can look at different products that we've reviewed and you can get our tasting notes. So again, when you walk into the liquor store, you know exactly what you're getting from that bottle that you pick up. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode where we talked about really what is whiskey. Please stick around, enjoy next episode where we talk about a different topic, probably like what is bourbon, because we're going to go through all these one by one. That way, when you go into a liquor store, you know exactly what you're looking for and you don't have to ask for help. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.